The Great Siege of Malta. This is based on the book The Great Siege by Ernest Bradford. And if the preface is any indication, he spent a lot of time researching this, largely because he loved Malta, but he found there wasn't really a definitive history of the Great Siege. And given how important the battle was to the flow of history, in particular to turning the tide against the Ottoman Empire, he felt it was a shame that it was only mentioned in passing. Because around this time period, you had three major victories for the Christians over the Ottoman Turks. You had the First Battle of Vienna. There was two sieges of Vienna. This being, just as a side note, there was only two battles that Suleiman the Magnificent lost. One was the First Battle of Vienna, and the second was the Great Siege of Malta. So you had the First Battle of Vienna, obviously the Battle of Lepanto, which happened after this, and the Great Siege. All three of these were military disasters for the Ottoman Empire, and the loss of the elite of the Ottoman army, just the cannons and resources involved, and the loss of prestige and morale more or less halted the Ottoman advance for quite some time. Many people expected that the Ottomans would just keep pushing westward, as it didn't really seem anybody could stop them. And so I think you can say that the Great Siege of Malta is of meta-historical importance. The term meta-historical importance meaning, did it have some sort of definitive effect on the greater flow of history, or was it kind of a flash in the pan? For instance, something that is sometimes said to have it but wouldn't would be the Third Battle of Kharkov, or Manstein's Miracle, which is the battle Manstein won. I think it was the last major victory by the Germans on the Eastern Front. And a lot of historians sympathetic to the Wehrmacht hold it up as this great victory, but it really didn't do anything to change the course of the war. Whereas something like Stalingrad was of great meta-historical significance, because if the Germans had managed to capture it, they would have cut off most of the Russian army's oil supplies, and the war might have gone very differently. So I think I'd say Malta was of great meta-historical importance, but like I said, it's kind of mentioned as a afterthought when you're talking about the other two more famous incidents. So before we get into the siege itself, what I'm going to tell you now, I'm not going to be able to cover everything that happened because it's a lengthy book I had to get through to even make this video. I'm not going to cover every attack and counterattack and every artillery bombardment and counter bombardment. I definitely get the book if you're interested in that. That is The Great Siege by Ernest Bradford. So I'm just going to try to cover the background, who was involved, why did it happen, what happened, and what was the aftermath. So we have our protagonists of the story, the Knights of St. John, or the Knights of St. John's Hospital, or the Knights Hospitallers, as they're otherwise known. So they were a monastic military brotherhood in a very similar vein to the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights. That was, as their name suggests, originally founded as a order dedicated to providing medical care to pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. And this was expanded into providing military services, and it just kind of snowballed. And you got this kind of another interesting case of this international state that had its own army, that had its own property, that had a lot of military, political, and financial power, but wasn't necessarily a country in the same way like the Kingdom of France was or the Kingdom of England was. Although what kind of sets the Hospitallers apart from the other two is just how long their order survived as a sovereign state, as in how long it survived with them holding territory. Because they had taken Rhodes in, I believe it was 1314, was taken and held by the Templars by the Hospitallers for several hundred years. And then after they were kicked out of there, they held Malta right up until they were displaced by Napoleon. So they more or less held territory as a sovereign state for longer than a lot of modern European countries have even been in existence. I mean, if you think about it, Hungary only really became an independent country after World War One, and you have a number of other examples, particularly in Eastern Europe, but you have countries like Ukraine and Poland and stuff. Poland is actually much younger because Poland's been annexed so many times. It's lasted for less time, at least modern Poland, than the Knights of St. John did. So the structure of it's pretty complex, and I'm not going to go into too much details about it, but basically it was known to be both aristocratic and to a certain extent meritocratic, and those things were somewhat in conflict. The highest level of the Order of Knights was drawn exclusively from European nobility, preferably senior European nobility, and you had to be able to prove that you were noble for the past three generations on both sides to get into it. You also had a lot of just other people who would join the order for various reasons, and all of them took monastic vows. However, by the time of the Great Siege, for a lot of them, they had become more symbolic. They maintained kind of all the nomenclature and thematic elements of the knights, but just in terms of, I guess you could say, worldly goods. I'm not sure how rigorous celibacy was. I don't think they married, but I don't think celibacy was as rigorously prosecuted. But they were still a military order. They were still very Catholic, and they were still dedicated to their war with the infidels. I should note that the Knights Hospitaller still exist today as the Sovereign Order of Malta. If you ever hear about the Military Sovereign Order of Malta, that is the modern version or the descendant of the Knights Hospitaller. But unlike the Templars or the Teutonic Knights, they weren't, I think, disbanded at any particular point in time. Anyways, back to the history. So after the fall of the Crusader states, the Hospitallers, or I just call them the Knights of St. John, invaded Rhodes and were able to take it, and they held it for several hundred years. And the knights, because did not have the manpower to directly fight the Muslims on land, as they were facing up against like Seljuk armies and Salahuddin and his successors' armies, these just huge numbers of Muslim forces, they switched over to becoming corsairs for Christ, or Christian corsairs. So they more or less became pirates that only attacked Islamic shipping. And because they were a military order, they were very, very disciplined, and most of them had immense amounts of experience. So they performed a lot better in naval combat than a lot of other navies of the time did. They were better with cannons and better with sword. In particular, since they were skilled in hand-to-hand combat, what they would do is basically fire all cannons, including shrapnel guns, go up alongside a ship, and then with their superior, I think they wore armor at sea, with their superior arms and armor and training, they would jump over and capture the ships. And they were a major thorn in the side of various Muslim powers, as they would just show up from nowhere. If there was single merchant ships, they would obviously capture those pretty easily, and then they were normally full of goods and people who could be sold off into slavery. I'm not exactly sure what the rules on slavery were at this time period, but non-Christians that they captured were sold off as slaves, primarily those captured in war. The Muslims also had a pretty thriving slave trade at this point, although they would more attack civilian targets right along the coast and capture women, particularly blonde women, which they would sell to the Ottoman upper class. But that's a story for another time. Whether you think regardless of what you think about it, at this time period, and I think up to the Napoleonic Wars even, Mediterranean galleys were rowed by galley slaves. The sails on them were very much secondary. You would have slaves that would row for up to 12, maybe more hours at a time, that would push the boats along. And it could get them to go to really high speeds when you were trying to capture another ship. Interestingly, the idea of using galley slaves, I believe, was a new one, because despite what Ben-Hur might tell you, the Romans and Greeks never used slaves to row galleys. The rowers in galleys were freedmen who had their own guild, were citizens or freedmen who had their own guild, and they were paid a wage similar to a dock worker. Also, they were only used on military ships because it was deemed too expensive for commercial vessels. And I mean, that makes sense because if you're having to pay them and you have to feed like hundreds of guys, also, it's a lot of room in the hold that could be carrying more supplies. So, as I said, they were a massive thorn in the side of the Muslims, and it meant that they could never have full control over the Eastern Mediterranean. Eventually, though, Suleiman the Magnificent was able to drive them out of Rhodes. Suleiman the Magnificent, as his name suggests, was one of the greatest rulers in Ottoman history, having captured, I believe, Libya, parts of the Middle East, and large portions of Eastern Europe. The battle for Rhodes had gone on for quite a while, and I believe it was Charles V who said, "No place was ever more well lost than was Rhodes." So Suleiman was able to take Rhodes. Now, something I don't think people realize is Rhodes, at least at this time, was an extremely wealthy island. It was a garden island. It was very easy to grow crops. The knights lived there with a great deal of, I don't know if luxury is the right term, but they never wanted for food supplies. And it was a really good location from which to run their order. So after they got kicked out of Rhodes, they basically went hand in hand from court to court within Europe and tried to figure out where they were going to move their order to. Because they didn't want to just become like the Knights Templar and not have any land and then eventually get guillotined by some greedy king. They wanted to continue the fight and have territory of their own. Now, the various princes of Europe weren't really keen on giving them any kind of quality land, like, I don't know, Corsica or Sardinia or the Majoric, the Belartic Isles, or any of the kind of other nice islands. They weren't really interested in giving them those. So eventually, Charles V saw a way of getting rid of some territory that was not particularly useful while also getting the knights off his back. So he gave them Malta and Tripoli. And yes, that is the Tripoli that's in North Africa, because it was in Christian hands at this point for some reason. And it was something the knights really didn't want because it's on the mainland. And it was kind of surrounded by Muslim powers, and they didn't have the military to hold an area, especially an area that was predominantly Islamic. And it was lost pretty quick after taking it. I don't think they made a particularly strong attempt to hold on to Tripoli. But yeah, the knights were given Malta, and they were told to set up there. Now, they were very reluctant to accept this, and if anything else had been given to them, they probably would have taken that instead. Malta was kind of, to put it mildly, a dump. It was extremely underdeveloped. It had pretty much no natural resources. It didn't have trees. It had very little surface water. There was very little in terms of grain. The only things of note it had were massive natural harbors. I mean, if you look at even the just the map I have up here, you can see these are like perfect natural harbors, more or less. They're protected from the sea. There's a lot of room to build boats, to hold boats, that sort of thing. And to the knights, that was really good because that was what they were. They were corsairs for Christ. They needed some place from which they could launch their raids. So reluctantly, knowing that nothing better would present itself, they wound up taking over Malta. So the Maltese speak a Semitic dialect that I believe was, at least at the time, mutually intelligible with Arabic. There's a couple countries within the EU that don't speak an Indo-European language. You have the Basques in Spain, you have the Hungarians, you have the Maltese, which speak a Semitic language, and the Finns, and I forget I think it's Latvia. I always get mixed up if it's Latvia or Estonia that has the random language that's not related to that's not an Indo-European dialect. So the Maltese are generally considered to be a Semitic people, at least at the time. However, they were very Christian, and Malta remains one of the most Christian countries in Europe to this day. They trace back their island being Christian to, I believe it's in the Bible, one of the letters of Paul. He gets ship, or in the Acts of the Apostles, but Paul gets shipwrecked on the island of Malta and converts the population. So the Maltese viewed themselves very proudly as Christians and viewed themselves as one of the oldest Christian populations in the world and were very dedicated to their faith. However, unfortunately, due to where they were almost constantly raided by Barbary pirates, Ottoman fleets, stuff like that. So the island was sacked on a semi regular basis. There was only one city of any note that was called Medina. Now, keep in mind, Medina is the generic term, I believe, in Arabic for the city. I think Medina just means the city. So the fact that it has the same name as Medina is in modern day Saudi Arabia or Hijaz is just a coincidence. Well, not even a coincidence. It's just because it's such a similar language. At the time, at least, the Maltese also called God Allah because all Allah means is the God. I would imagine because God in Hebrew is Elohim, which sounds very similar to Allah. So I would imagine it's the same word. It's just obviously slightly different, kind of like how you have Deus and Dio, depending on which Latin language you're talking about. But I'm kind of getting off of topic here. But that was more or less the only city of note. There was a couple primitive fortifications there, but nothing like what the Knights were used to. They had built massive defense and depth works on roads, which is partially why they were able to hold out so long. So the Knights wound up coming to Malta, and they more or less ignored, I believe, most of the population. They just, because they were only really interested in the coastal areas with the large natural harbors. They didn't really care that much about the civilian population, who were a race of short, wretched people who spent their lives toiling in the dirt or fishing in the sea on small boats to barely eke out a living. So, from how the book describes it, while there was no love lost between the two, there wasn't any actual animosity. The Knights were focused on being corsairs for Christ, and the Maltese were focused on their fairly miserable lives, frankly. And so, to a certain extent, though, and this will happen later on, once the siege happened, the Maltese went all in. There's no record of any Maltese defecting to the Muslims. They really, really hated the Turks and the Muslims because of how often their island had been raided and their family members had been taken away as slaves. And they fought just as hard and just as brutally and just as determinedly as the soldiers who had taken vows to die for Christ did. And in a battle that was, if anything, a test of endurance, you really couldn't ask for a better people to join in than the Maltese. Once we get into the actual battles, they tirelessly help the Knights out, bringing them food and water, repairing fortifications. At one point, when Medina almost gets attacked, the women and children get dressed up in uniforms and pretend to be a garrison to scare off the Ottoman forces. At any rate, though, if you're trying to go through from the eastern to the western Mediterranean, there's really only two ways you can do that: under and above Sicily. Above Sicily is kind of suicide because of how close it is to the mainland, and there's powerful Christian kingdoms there, such as the two Sicilies. I think it was part of Spain at this point in time. The status of southern Italy changes so many times. I think it was part of Aragorn, because later on we hear that the ruler of Sicily was a vassal to, they call him the Emperor of Spain. But it was kind of suicide to go that way. So the other way is under Sicily, and Malta's pretty much, I guess it's a bit closer to Sicily than it is to North Africa. But it has a pretty good coverage of that area. So if the Muslims wanted to go from Algiers or Tunis, or even just import goods from France, who was allied to them at this point in time, they would have to go past Malta. And the Knights made good use of this, and they more or less were constantly harassing Ottoman shipping. They would take the ships, sell the crew into slavery, generally speaking, or use them as galley slaves, and they take huge cargoes of goods like silk. Keep in mind, the Ottoman Empire was very wealthy through trade because of things like silk, spices, sugar, coffee, things that came from the Orient that they were shipping across the Mediterranean, probably to France. And the knights were able to intercept these transports going there or coming back with gold and steal it. And that's how they were largely able to finance their order. And they used the money to build up the various castles. Now, it was around this time that our main protagonist, Grand Master Valette, for whom the city Valletta, the capital of Malta, is named, became leader. He was an incredibly pious, dedicated, intelligent, and vigorous man who succeeded at pretty much everything he put his mind to. And the order flourished and underwent a revival under him. Partially because the order was doing so well and they were sinking so many Ottoman ships, Suleiman the Magnificent decided it was finally time to deal with this thorn in his side. The tax revenue, like the loss of the trade and the tax revenue, while not crippling, was certainly annoying. And unless Malta could be dealt with, the Ottomans would never be able to raid the Western Mediterranean properly. And there was some plans regarding the taking of Sicily, because if they could take Sicily, then they could move into mainland Sicily and maybe even attack and loot Rome itself. See, at this point in time, the Ottomans were just wiping the floor with everybody all over the place, and so it really didn't seem like there was any reason to stop. And sometimes there's a term called victory disease, where if you win too many times, you start to think you're invincible, and then you just keep going. And that was, I think, something Japan encountered a lot after the the Russo-Japanese War, I should say, where they just felt that they were unstoppable as they kept blowing through everything they were fighting, and they kind of just kept expanding the war again and again and again. And you could probably say the same thing about Germany entering World War One, because they had whipped the French and Austrians so easy a couple decades previously. They figured it was just going to be a repeat. So to Suleiman, even if it seems kind of crazy to us, he was saying, okay, so it stalled a bit in mainland Europe. We got stopped at Vienna, but I still have tons of money. I still have the Janissaries. I still have all this other stuff. So I might as well make a go at Malta. If I can capture Malta, I can move the fleet there. And even if I'm not going to attack Sicily, it'll make shipping safe and help out the economy a bunch. Also, his wives just nagged him a lot. Because one of the things his wives would often engage in is sponsoring trade galleys from the East and Western Mediterranean, and they kept getting captured and reducing his wives to debt and bankruptcy, and they nagged him a bunch. I don't think that that's why it happened, but it is kind of a funny image of Suleiman getting nagged by his harem, and him just saying, fine, by Allah, I'm going to invade Malta. So he put together a massive invasion force. Now the numbers we're going to have to take with a grain of salt, because the issue is you have the Janissaries, then you have the sailors, then you have allied states like Egypt, Algiers, Tunisia, and the numbers aren't exactly reliable, but we can say roughly there was about 35 to 40,000 total Muslims that departed and would wind up on Malta. Once again, these numbers are not really well known. Or rather, it's not that they're well known, it's because, I mean, the Ottomans had their records and the Christians had their records, but just kind of the nature of the Ottoman fleet, it was kind of hard to make any exact determination of who was who. Now, merchants who had gone to Constantinople had heard about this, because it was impossible to keep the gathering of such a large fleet and army secret. And they immediately told the Knights of Malta. And the Knights of Malta under Valette decided, okay, they're going to siege us, but we're going to win because we're the Knights of Christ, and to die in service of our Lord and Savior is the highest honor a man can seek to obtain. So, heading into the Great Siege, the knights had stocked up on food as much as possible, as much water as they possibly could. They had huge stores of cannonballs and shot for arquebuses and gunpowder. Interestingly, despite the brutal nature of the siege, they never ran out of provisions, nor I think were they in any immediate danger of running out of provisions. When they ran around to the various kings and queens of Europe, a lot of them didn't want to send any military units, so they just gave them money, which the money I don't think was a lot, but the order wasn't huge, and you can buy a lot of water and stuff. One of the problems with Malta is something the Turks would find is there's not really much in the way of natural water on the island, and there's not very much in the way of anything you can forage. And that was kind of one of the issues when they were facing the Ottomans in Rhodes, is they could live off of the land because of how lush Rhodes was. That wasn't going to be an issue here. While I believe there was some water on Malta, by and large, the Turks would have to bring all the food with them and additional water with them. And if you have an army of like 35 to 40,000 people, that's really difficult because keep in mind Sicily is controlled by the Christians. They have to bring it in from North Africa, and it's just kind of a logistical mess. So heading into it, Valette had spent a lot of time just stockpiling, getting the fortifications ready because he knew the Muslims were coming, and he wanted to have everything set up for this epic conflict that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean and perhaps Christendom itself. So that's part one of what happened. Part two, I'm going to cover the actual battle itself and hopefully the aftermath. I'll see how long it takes. This introduction ran longer than I thought it was going to be, but I think there's a lot of good stuff that we talked about here. So we're going to do part two soon enough.